Welcome back. This is part 2 of our journey into Tanzania. In the last episode, we stepped into the land itself, the footprints in its soil, the stories in its memory, and the name that binds its people together. But to understand Tanzania's history, we must also understand the players who shaped it, the groups of people whose power, faith, and ambitions left their mark here. Some came as rulers, some as merchants, some as conquerors, and others as colonizers. Each had their role, whether in trade, in faith, in betrayal, or in survival. These are the people we will meet in the coming episodes. To walk into their stories later, we must first know who they were. For history is not only about dates and treaties, it is about the lives, the choices, and the consequences that Allah allowed to unfold. In this episode, I will introduce you to them: the Omani Sultanate and its Arab elites, the British, the Germans, the Wahhab movement, the Ibadis of Oman and Zanzibar, the African peoples of the interior, and the rival empires that circled the coast. By the end, you will know who is who, and you'll be ready for the stories of how they shaped Tanzania, for better or for worse. In the early 1800s, power on the Swahili Coast shifted into new hands. The Omani Sultanate, an Arab dynasty from Muscat across the sea, began to move its center southward. By Allah's will, the Indian Ocean, once a distance, became a bridge. Sultan Sayyid ibn Sultan, who ruled from 1804 to 1856, made a decision that would change East Africa forever. He left Muscat and established his throne in Stone Town, Zanzibar. From that moment, Zanzibar was no longer just an island. It was the beating heart of a thriving empire. The Sultan's court became the command post of trade, power, and politics. Cloves turned into gold on the plantations, ivory poured in from the deep interior, and human lives, enslaved men, women, and children, became the labor that fueled his vision. This was the world he created, a system of wealth built on the backs of others. Yet he did not rule alone. Day by day, authority in coastal towns like Bagamoyo rested in the hands of local liwalis, governors, often drawn from Swahili Arab families who had long lived on the coast. They collected duties, managed caravans, and carried the Sultan's will inland. It was in their homes and caravanserais that the journeys from the lakes to the sea began and ended. Their power was smaller than the Sultan's, but in daily life it was their word that mattered most. Still, no empire stands untouched. As the Sultan expanded his wealth, Britain and France watched closely, each with their own ambitions. They saw Zanzibar not only as a spice island, but as a key to Africa. And while treaties were signed and promises made, history would prove that even the strongest throne could not escape the shadows of foreign empires. But that betrayal, and the storms it brought, will come later in our story. For now, remember this: the Omani Sultanate did not just visit East Africa, it made Zanzibar its home. Arab rulers and African shores became bound together, and the destiny of Tanzania was tied to Arabia, the Indian Ocean, and the wider world. By the late 1800s, a new power arrived on the coast, not with caravans or wooden sailing ships, but with treaties, warships, and consuls. Britain declared Zanzibar a protectorate in 1890, and from that moment the Sultan's crown was no longer free. He remained on the throne, but only as a figurehead, a shadow ruler whose words carried weight only when the British agreed. The British came with a message of morality, presenting themselves as the ones who would end slavery. In 1873, they shut down the slave market in Stone Town, building a church over its ground as a symbol of their victory. Their navy patrolled the seas, intercepting slave ships and branding themselves the protectors of freedom. But beneath the slogans of abolition, they redirected Zanzibar's wealth into their own hands. Clove plantations continued, now under wage labor instead of chains, and taxes on exports and imports filled colonial accounts. By Allah's will, nations rise and nations fall, and no empire steps onto new soil without consequence. The British did not erase Zanzibar's sultanate. They hollowed it, keeping the throne in place while draining its power. Missionaries built schools, hospitals, and churches, reshaping the island's identity under the banner of anti-slavery. Yet for those who lived through it, it was not only freedom they felt, but the weight of another master. Britain called it a protectorate. History remembers it as the moment Zanzibar became a colony dressed in finer words. While Britain took Zanzibar, Germany claimed the mainland. In the late 1800s, they declared Tanganyika part of their new colony, German East Africa. Bagamoyo, once a vibrant coastal town tied to caravan routes, briefly became their first colonial capital before Dar es Salaam took its place. German officials replaced the Swahili Arab Liwalis who had governed coastal towns for generations. They parceled out land to themselves, planting sisal, coffee, and cotton. Africans were told slavery was ending, but freedom was only written on paper. In truth, men, women, and children who once carried loads and chains were forced into contracts, laboring for German estates under new names, but the same suffering. By Allah's will, no injustice lasts forever, but while it stood, German rule was harsh. Taxes were demanded, crops were seized, and those who resisted faced brutal punishment. The heaviest blow came during the Maji Maji Rebellion of 1905 to 1907, when Africans rose against forced labor and foreign oppression. They believed sacred water would turn German bullets to water, but tens of thousands were slaughtered before the uprising was crushed. For Tanganyika, Germany's time was short, less than half a century, yet its scars were deep. Bagamoyo, once a gateway of trade, became a station of colonial rule, and the people learned that when one master leaves, another may quickly take his place. Not all forces that touched Tanzania came with ships and flags. Some came with ideas. In the mid-17th century, in the deserts of Najd in Arabia, a preacher named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab began calling for what he saw as a return to pure Islam. He condemned practices like honoring saints at shrines and many Sufi traditions as dangerous innovations. His words found power when he allied with Muhammad ibn Saud, a tribal leader, and together they built a movement that would shape Arabia for centuries. This was Wahhabism, a strict call to Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, interpreted literally and enforced harshly. Its supporters saw it as a revival of true Islam. Its critics saw it as rigid and intolerant. By Allah's decree, knowledge spreads in many ways, and by the 19th century, Wahhabi teachings reached the wider Indian Ocean, whispered through traders, pilgrims, and travelers. In East Africa, the Swahili Coast already held its own Islamic traditions, deeply tied to Sufism, poetry, and community rituals. Wahhabi voices arrived like sharp winds, challenging those practices, labeling them as shirk. For some, it was a call to purify faith. For others, it was a challenge to ways of worship they had lived with for generations. Their presence in Tanzania was never as direct as a government or an army, but their influence stirred debates, shaped alliances, and created tensions that still echo today. They remind us that ideas, like empires, can cross seas. and that not all battles are fought with swords. Some are fought with words, with belief, with the meaning of what it means to serve Allah. Long before Wahhabism rose in Arabia, another branch of Islam had already taken root, one that would shape Oman and Zanzibar for centuries. The Ibadis are among the oldest communities in Islam, dating back to the late 600s, before the Sunni-Shia split became the main dividing line. By Allah's will, their path survived in smaller numbers, carried into Oman, parts of North Africa, and the East African coast. Their reputation was one of moderation. Unlike harsher sects, they avoided declaring other Muslims unbelievers. They believed sinful Muslims were still part of the Ummah, even if weak in faith. Leadership for them was not about bloodlines or dynasties, but about piety and competence. A ruler could be chosen, and if unjust, he could be removed. It was a faith that tried to hold balance between authority and community. In daily life, Ibadas looked much like Sunnis. They prayed, fasted, gave zakat, and made hajj. Their jurisprudence was distinct, but close to Shafi law, the school most East Africans followed. That closeness made coexistence easier. By Allah's wisdom, they lived alongside Sunnis without constant strife. This is why Sultan Sayyid ibn Sultan could be Ibad, while many of his subjects were Sun, and they still saw each other as Muslims. For Zanzibar, Ibadism mattered because it shaped the ruling class. It gave the Omani elite a sense of religious identity, one they carried into their politics and their society. And while it did not spread widely among Africans, it framed how Omanis ruled, with their own understanding of justice, faith, and authority. These are the names you must remember: the Omani Sultanate and its Arab elites, the British and the Germans who arrived with flags. And treaties, the Wahhabi voices that carried sharp winds across the Indian Ocean, the Ibads who shaped Zanzibar's rulers, and above all, the African peoples whose lives and strength gave Tanzania its soul. Each carried their role, each left their mark. But this is only the map. In the episodes to come, we will step deeper into betrayals, into alliances, into the struggles that turned these groups from names into forces that changed Tanzania forever. By Allah's will, history is not only about rulers and empires, but about how every life, every choice, and every prayer ties into the story of a people. For now, carry these names with you, because in our next adventure, we will walk into their actions, and you will see why Tanzania remembers them still.